U.S. electoral politics in historical perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a four-part series with our extraordinary national historian, Dr. Robert L. Harris. I'm Brother Joe Paul, your Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer. I want to share a little bit about this historical perspective. Each historical conversation will be paired with one of our past and current general presidents of this dear fraternity. We're going to be discussing the law and order trope from 1968 to 2020. I want to share a little bit about our incredible national historian, if I could. Brother Dr. Robert L. Harris Jr. is a professor emeritus of African American history, American studies, and public affairs at Cornell University, from which he's also vice provost for diversity and faculty development. He received his PhD in U.S. history from Northwestern University and has been a Rockefeller Foundation Humanities Fellow at the State University of New York, Buffalo. He's also a W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow at Harvard University, Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow. He's also a Rockefeller Research Fellow and a National Endowment for Humanities Fellow. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History awarded him the Carter G. Woodson Scholars Medallion for Distinguished Research, Writing, and Activism. He's the author of Teaching African American History, The History of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, A Tradition of Leadership and Service, and co-editor of the Columbia Guide to African American History since 1939, as well as more than 50 articles, chapters, and books and dictionary entries. He is the past president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. He's the co-founder of the History Social Studies Committee of the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards and national historian for our dear fraternity, among so many other positions. He was history consultant for Rubicon Productions' Emmy Award-winning Build the Dream on the Martin Luther King Jr. Washington, D.C. Memorial, and last but not least, A Century of Leadership and Service. He also served as history consultant for the Writers Guild of America, Best Television Documentary, Billy Strayhorn, Lush Life, The American Experience, Ulysses S. Grant, and Trouble Behind, a documentary of the 1919 Corbin, Kentucky race riot. He also wrote the Prime School Television Teacher Guides for I Remember Harlem, Roots, The Next Generation, and Roots, the original saga of an American family. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present to you and introduce to some our national historian, Brother Dr. Robert L. Harris. Brother Dr. Harris, welcome to the conversation. We're so excited to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Brother Paul, for that very kind and generous, I must say, introduction.
It's my pleasure. I know you have the check in the mail, so I'll keep looking for that, and I'll keep doing outstanding introductions of you. So no, we're excited about this conversation, and without further ado, I'd like to take this point of personal privilege to introduce to some and welcome to many our General President, Brother Dr. Everett B. Ward, who will help guide our conversation along with our national historian. Brother Dr. Ward, our General President, I want to say good evening, my brother. How are you?
I'm doing well, Brother Paul. It's an honor to be with you and to be with our outstanding and celebrated historian who is a scholar beyond measure.
Fantastic, fantastic. My brothers, we're going to turn over the conversation to you experts so you can guide the conversation. We are going to ask if anyone is attending live to please leave any comments or questions in our comment section on Facebook Live. And I look forward to a wonderful conversation, brothers.
Thank you.
Well, Brother Dr. Ward and I have had many informal chats about history. And I've always found it to be very enlightening to get his perspective on things. When he asked me if I would put something together as we approach the election, I thought about what we historians basically do, and that's to provide a context for what's happening, for what's taking place, so that people have some framework for understanding different developments, and to some extent, why those developments are taking place. I call this the trope of law and order. And being an academic, I need to define trope for you because not everyone understands the word trope. A trope is anything that gets used often enough to become recognized. And Donald Trump has used the law and order trope. He's repeated it on a number of occasions, and those individuals who follow him have an understanding of what this trope means. Not everyone might understand it, but many of those individuals who are his followers, they understand what it means. And in broad strokes, it means to keep the Black people in their place. Now, there's been a historical effort on the part of white America. I mean, it's part of our history that we were supposed to stay in our place, not to get out of our place. Donald Trump more recently has talked about keeping the suburbs safe and secure. And that's one of those things where, you know, there are people who understand that he wants to keep African Americans and other people of color out of the suburbs. That's how his election campaign, he has talked about, and I don't know if many of you saw the recent trip that he made in which he spoke. He was supposed to be speaking about COVID-19, but he began to talk about law and order as he spoke before a group of sheriffs. And he, in talking about this, was looking at the notion of keeping America safe. Now, I'm not sure of what, other than what he used when he talked about his election initially, and he used the Latinx community as a foil to say that they were criminals, bring crime to the country, and what have you. And so now he's looking at, in many respects, African Americans as being a disruptive force in the society. He's talked about, and he said that if Joe Biden is elected president, that there will be chaos and bloodshed in the streets of America. Now, that's enough to send chills down the spines of most people in this country, that there's going to be chaos and bloodshed. That's something that we have to think about, that the President of the United States has forecasted, if his opponent wins, that people cannot be safe and secure. And Maryland, of course, is a predominantly Democratic state, so we're not seeing some of the ads. I know Brother Ward mentioned to me one of the, or a couple of the ads that are running in North Carolina, which is a close state. And he, or his campaign, is trying to scare, especially white women in North Carolina. Brother Ward, you might mention a couple of those advertisements that are being run in North Carolina.
Well, I think Brother Harris, you understand as a historian, this is not a new tactic in campaigning at all. To use fear and to use African Americans as a wedge issue in politics. We've seen that happen before. But I think what we've noticed is that in target states like North Carolina, I've watched several commercials where you have women who are in their homes alone. I think the last one is there's a mother with her child, and the child goes under the bed. and they are trying to dial 911 to indicate that under the Biden presidency, there is no police there to save you from crime and those kind of things. But when we go back as late as 1898, 1948, 1968, I know we're going to talk about that even further. There's always been this law and order political propaganda that has been used in campaigns.
Yes. And Donald Trump has a way of using these words, these veiled messages, if you will. And if there's not really something that has happened, he will make it up and use it as a way. We know that during his administration, he's lied on so many occasions that it's hard to count it, but he's taken advantage of the demonstrations that have occurred after the murder of George Floyd. And this, of course, harkens back to the 1960s. As you mentioned, 1968, there were uprisings that occurred throughout the country in the late 1960s. And then with the assassination of Dr. King, there was uprisings, violence that occurred. But we also have to remember that in the late 1960s, it was not just the anger of African Americans, but there was also the protest against the war in Vietnam.
That's exactly.
And one of the worst acts of violence occurred in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention in 1968. And so, Richard Nixon used this as a means of saying that we've got to have law and order in this country. George Wallace used it as a means of saying that we've got to have law and order in this country. And one of the things that I'm really very much concerned about, because in many of these demonstrations, you have agent provocateurs who take on certain acts of violence that the organizers of the demonstrations did not really sanction. These are individuals who've taken it upon themselves. In fact, they've been sent there to disrupt the demonstrations and to commit acts of violence. And this just basically plays into the hands of Donald Trump. There are a lot of people who speculated that he might declare a state of national emergency before the election and use that as a way to send in his so-called law enforcement officials. And that's something we have to be very much concerned about.
But Dr. Harris, you remember that it was also in the civil rights movement that there were people who were sent into those peaceful, nonviolent protests to cause disruption, and that was their primary objective, to incite riots and violence totally against Brother King's and others' nonviolent approach to the civil rights movement. So it's important for all of us to understand the historical legacy of oppressive and voter suppression and campaign tactics to suppress the vote and to alter the conversation, the public discourse, away from the real issues that are important. You mentioned George Wallace in his campaign in 1968 as a third-party candidate. And I was reading his speech that he gave at Madison Square Garden in 1968 to some 20,000 persons in Madison Square Garden. And I'd like to just read an excerpt of that. And it says, "I'm talking about law and order. The Supreme Court of our country has handcuffed the police. And tonight, if you walk out of this building and are knocked in the head, the person who knocks you in the head is out of jail before you get to the hospital. And on Monday morning, they'll be trying the policeman about it." So again, you can see that introduction of trying to paint this chaotic, uncontrollable society. And that's why I've got to be the law and order president again.
Yeah, and this is why we've got to exercise, I think, quite a bit of discipline until after November 3rd. Now, I hope that we will remain disciplined even afterwards. But, they use this as a tactic, as a means. They say it is a trope that they've used, and it helps them to secure their base. They are very much people, everyone is basically concerned about their safety and their security. But the way that Donald Trump uses this is basically to keep you safe from those sort of marauding Black people. You don't want them in your neighborhood. They'll ruin your property values. And this is one of the things that many, I would say, white Americans and some Black Americans too, hold very sacred, their property values. That's their major investment. And so if anything's going to happen that's going to ruin their property values, they become very much concerned about it. When I was in the classroom, I used to ask my students, what's the difference between a white liberal and a white conservative? And they would look at me, they would be kind of puzzled. What is he talking about? The difference between a white liberal and a white conservative? And I would tell them, a home mortgage. A lot of young white folks who are very liberal. And I hope that the people who are supporting the Black Lives Matter campaign, and it might be a little different this time, but for many young white people, once they start a family, buy a home, get a mortgage, they may have been quite liberal in their outlook before, but all of a sudden they become rather conservative because they see themselves as having something to conserve, something to protect. And I'm concerned that this is one of the things that might lead to the decline of the support. And, as someone mentioned to me the other day, a lot of what's happening with the demonstrations, with this whole COVID-19, people have a little more time on their hands. So they've been able to organize in ways that they may not have been able to organize before. But I think in a way things are beginning to change. The idea of systemic racism is something that people did not want to talk about 10, 15 years ago. In fact, the current Attorney General, William Barr, when he was being interviewed by Congress, when he had to testify on the whole COVID-19 situation, he rejected the idea of institutional racism. And we have moved from the idea of racism, prejudice, being something that's individual. We know that this is something that is pretty much baked into the society. And you have to look at institutional structures in order to get rid of institutional racism, to try to keep racism itself from rearing its ugly head. Now, to some extent, also, the slogan that the some of the demonstrators, and I don't think all of them were involved in this, the idea of dismantle the police, defund the police. That's something that, of course, Trump has taken up and his supporters have taken up. As you mentioned, the advertisement where you try to dial 911 and there's no answer, that frightens a lot of people. And so that's something that I think we have to be concerned about in our march to the polls. Now, I know you've been involved in political action for some time. The vote in November, are we going to be able to secure that? Are we going to be able to get people to vote by mail? Of course, there are a lot of people who are very reluctant to go to a polling place. There are even people who generally work at the polls who are reluctant with this. And this is a very infectious virus that we need to look at. It, more than past viruses, is so infectious and people can catch it. But what do you think about, I mean, are we going to have the march to the polls from the churches in this election?
One of the things that I think is important is for us to understand that historically, the right to vote has been jeopardized so much, and for African Americans in particular, that the power of the vote is so important that I think even in some of the unprecedented times that we find ourselves in now, I think people will make a concerted effort to be very intentional to vote in this election. You know, if you think about the days of the 1950s and the 1960s, and even before then, we can go all the way back, Brother Harris, to Reconstruction, when the right to vote was granted and people understood that they could lose their very lives if they voted, lose their property. And they made the effort to vote with all of those challenges confronting them. So I think we as a people have a history of understanding the challenges before us and still taking that courageous step to exercise the right to vote. I know our conversation, and as historians, you certainly are prepared as a scholar to talk about the historical legacy that we have experienced in the political process. And one of the points that I think is critical for us to emphasize tonight is that there is not only a history with the current occupant of the White House, but there's also on both sides of the aisle, both parties have been involved in voter suppression. Because if we remember, here in North Carolina, for example, in 1898, when there was this legitimized armed forces where elected officials in Wilmington, North Carolina, Black elected officials at gunpoint were taken out of office, but it was under this political campaign of Negro domination, that if we do not take our country back, that there will be this over presence of Negro domination. And as scholars, you can trace that same language from 1898 to 2020. And so, you know, we saw it with in 1948 when Strong Thurmond walked out of the Democratic Convention in 1948 because President Harry Truman was putting forth a civil rights platform. and he walked out and formed the Dixiecrats. So there has been voter suppression and political wedge issues with African Americans on both sides of the aisle. And I think it's important, as you said in your introductory remarks, as a historian, you are putting a context so people can understand that there is a long history and a legacy that we are witnessing yet again. And it's our hope that understanding that historical context, that it will be used, that understanding will be used as a way to understand why your vote is so important, and why we must, as our fraternity brothers started in the 1930s, a voteless people is a hopeless people. And the whole voter education program must be paramount now even more than before.
Yes, and it's so easy to take some of these things for granted.
Yeah.
There are people who were so jubilant after the election of Barack Obama. We got a black man in the White House. Well, that was important, but that was only a start. That wasn't a finish. And that's what we've got to think about. The great labor leader, A. Philip Randolph, who helped to organize the March on Washington in 1963, said, "Freedom is never a final fact. If you're going to maintain your freedom, you've got to work to preserve it." And that's one of the things that we need to understand, and we've got to impress among our people. I think that the younger generation coming along, and I employ the energy, the enthusiasm of the younger demonstrators, but this is we've been fighting this for what? At least 250 years?
That's right.
This is not something that is going to be resolved overnight. When we go and vote, that in some respects is the beginning of the process. That's not the end of the process, because we've got to hold those individuals who are elected, we've got to hold their feet to the fire. Lyndon Johnson basically acknowledged that it was because of the pressure being placed upon him that he would propose a voting rights bill. It wasn't something that he dreamed about at night and thought up and said, I should push a voting rights bill forward. No, it was the pressure. It was the boots on the pavement, so to speak, that persuaded him. And that's where we have to remain vigilant at all times. And we need to look at this as a process, not as something that and this might not be the best example, but I used to say to students that, protecting our rights is not like getting an inoculation, a vaccination, and saying that now we are protected. I mean, even if you get a vaccination, you've got to get a booster shot. That's right. People talk about, well, you're just talking to the choir. But I say, remember, the choir's got to practice if they're going to give a good performance. They don't just jump out there without any practice. And so we do need to remind the choir now and again about what's at stake. And that's one of the things that we've got to really look at, we've got to think about. I had some qualms about the Million Man March, but after the Million Man March, I noticed that people began to look at me a little differently, that I was accorded a little more respect than I had been beforehand. Now, it took that massive demonstration for people to realize these people are serious, you know? And we have to now and again remind ourselves as well as the country at large about our seriousness. And I think it's been kind of easy for us now. As soon as Barack Obama was elected president, we may have been jubilant about that. But what did the majority leader in the Senate from Kentucky say? We've got to make sure that he's a one-term president.
That's right.
He did not see the legitimacy of Barack Obama's election as president of the United States. And there were some white women, and we've got to acknowledge, recognize that white women, over 50%, voted for Donald Trump. Some of them were a little bit upset. Black family in the White House? What's going on in this country? You know? So we've got to look, and we are going to, in this webinar series, we're going to discuss the demographics, the polls, and what we should be aware of as we come closer to the election. But we really need, you know, you asked me to write an article on the citizenship education campaign that our fraternity initiated. And they saw that it was important not just to get people registered to vote, but for people to understand, again, that voting was a process.
And I think also
something
that campaign also, I think, emphasized that politics and civic engagement is something that happens 365 days of the year. And it's, as you've said, it's not just on election day, but it's also about what happens at the local level. So what happens at your school board, what happens at your state legislative level. All of those are important. Who your governor is, who your county commissioner is that represents you. All of that is important, and it's not just the presidential election, but it's the election cycle throughout the entire political process, both in presidential years as well as off presidential years. And the whole citizenship campaign was to educate citizens. We sought to give the community an educational vehicle so that they could make informed decisions based on the experience and the qualifications of the candidates, as well as the critical issues that were confronting them. And I think that's critical in this election and every election, that we do not get distracted with temporary political propaganda that takes us away from the real important issues of the economy, of education, of healthcare, of international diplomacy and foreign policy. We've got to stay focused on those issues and make certain that we don't allow people to distract the electorate from what's really important. And that's why I really applaud the young people in Black Lives Matter, because they're talking about issues. It's not only police violence, but it's also the criminal justice reform that needs to happen, the whole prison, the pipeline of young people being identified and placed into privatized prisons, the privatization and the money that is being made from those type of incarceration methods. There are so many issues that we've got to stay focused on and demand that the elected officials that we support address those issues, and that federal policy and federal legislation deals with those critical issues. And that's why these webinars are so important, because we've got to help educate. And I really believe, Dr. Harris, that this is the continuation of what Brother Dr. Rayford Logan began in 1930. And here we are in 2020 using the platform that's available to us now to further educate the community. And as a fraternity, we are not advocating a political party or a candidate. We are talking to a historian who is giving us the context and the historical frame of reference so that we can make better informed decisions.
Yes, indeed. And, we have to recognize that these are issues that we've been dealing with over time. We approach them a little differently depending upon the times. We can't take a script from the 1930s and use that script without some modification to address some of the issues that we're facing today. The whole thing of social media, this is something that no one could hardly conceive of in the 1930s, but it plays such a critical role today. There's so many people who get their information from social media. And we saw in 2016 the way in which social media was used, in many respects targeting the Black community, saying, neither of these candidates have your interest at heart. And so you don't need to participate in this election. We're going to see some of those things crop up. Donna Brazil has written, I think, a very good book reflecting on the election in 2016, in which she talks about the effort on the part of the Soviet Union with, and I can't remember the two names, but one was called Cozy Bear, and I forgot what the other one's name was, but they were basically involved in not necessarily saying who you should vote for, but giving you a sense that participating in the electoral process was not in your self-interest. And
what I would say, that's a new form of voter suppression.
Yes.
That's clearly voter suppression, using a new platform to suppress the vote, and particularly suppress the Black vote and votes of color. And I think to your point, I think we should expect to see more of that in this election. Already, when the election is being questioned, the outcome of the election, the speculation of the election being corrupt, it being articulated is going to be one of the most corrupt elections. But as it has already been stated, even during the Civil War, even during World War, we always had elections. And I don't think there's been any question about the integrity of the election. And even when people have attempted to say that there's been voter fraud, when the facts were really investigated, it was less than 1% of voter fraud. But in fact, people built an entire campaign saying that there was this vast voter fraud happening in American political process. But when the facts were really investigated, it was not true. But again, to try to paint that picture that there's great fraud in the electoral process.
Well, one of the things that individuals have done in totalitarian states is to promote what's called the big lie. And here we have an instance of a big lie being promoted. And sometimes if you say it often enough, people will begin to believe it. But we have, a responsibility for individuals to think critically about the electoral process, not just follow blindly either what we're saying or what someone else is saying. But hopefully we have raised some issues that people will think about, will contemplate, and that will help them in the decision that they make when they go to the polls, when they talk to their neighbors. One of the things I miss during this COVID-19 is being able to go and sit in the barbershop, because when I sit in the barbershop and talk to the brothers there, I get a sense of what people on the ground are talking about.
Yes.
Brother Paul, do you have any questions for us?
We do. We do have brothers who are leaving questions in a comment. We wanted to, this conversation is captivating. And so thank you both, my brothers, for sharing your expertise on the topic. Are we ready for one of our questions from the comments?
Yes.
Very well. We have Brother Keith Singleton who asked a two-part question. One, how do we address the Electoral College? And also, how do we address the cynicism and superstition that discourages people of color from voting?
I'll take the second part of that. And Brother Ward, I think given your involvement with the Democratic National Committee, you might take the first part.
All right. Well, I think clearly we understand that the Electoral College is key. And that's why there are certain states that have already been targeted, those states that have high electoral colleges. So that's why going to vote is so important, because the person who wins the state receives those electoral votes. And those electoral votes, you have to have 270 electoral college votes in order to win. And so it's critical that we go vote and we make sure we win the states that are so important to the Electoral College. I think one of the other items that's real key, and I know Brother Harris will talk about that further, is the Southern strategy that's often used to try to disenfranchise Black voters. And that's why it's important that we go out and vote and be very involved in the election process. And then I also encourage people to run to be your Electoral College representative in your state, because you are the person that will cast the vote, the electoral vote, at that given time at your respective state capitals.
I think we are we okay now? So we're having a little connection problem. But the brother asked about the cynicism and superstition that discourages people of color from voting. And, we've got to remember and celebrate our victories. People did not give Barack Obama much of a chance of being elected president of the United States. But it was basically the turnout of large numbers of African Americans who got fired up and ready to go, who went out to the polls, and the young, I would say, white college age kids, students, maybe I shouldn't call them kids, who went out and who voted for Barack Obama. Now, if we did that before, we can do it again. We need to basically put cynicism aside. Superstition, I don't know about. Maybe we have to get some good juju in order to influence the election. But there have been points in the past where we have prevailed, and we've got to dwell on those and not become cynical about the present.
Fantastic. Great feedback, my brothers. Are we ready for one other question?
Yes, indeed.
Fantastic. We have a question from Brother Marcus Berry. He says, brothers, do you feel that some form of reparation will happen in the near future? And how do you feel about the issue overall?
Well, I have looked a bit at this issue, and of course, when you start talking about reparations, uh, people begin to think, am I going to get a check in the mail? And there's so many different former congressmen from Congress to look at the issue of reparations. And as I say, reparations can take a number of forms. If you look at the word reparations, we're looking really to repair. And there are a number of ways that we can repair the injustices that have been done, that have been committed against African Americans. And we need to have a serious discussion about the different forms that reparations should take. Now, I'm from, of course, a little bit of an older generation, as you can tell. But I oftentimes thought that if they get rid of affirmative action, which in many respects they now have done, we're going to have to move to some form of reparations. Brother Ward?
Yes, well, one of the things that happened here in North Carolina, the city of Asheville recently passed a provision to look at reparations. But what they did that I thought was very commendable, they looked at how funding and allocation could go to institutions and programs and other economic development initiatives that would have a benefit to the total community. And I would favor that type of appropriation and allocation more so than an individual contribution. Because if you look, for example, at historically Black colleges in this country, there are many historically Black colleges that could benefit from financial support and allocation to help in so many areas at historically Black colleges. When you talk about building the intellectual capital of the nation, I think that is a certain positive way that it could happen. I think that also there needs to be a major investment in our cities and rural communities, where when you live in what I call the tale of two cities, where there's vast urban development and economic development on one side of town, and there's a great disparity when you look at the traditional defined African American community. And so economic development and investment in those ways, I think, are major efforts that could happen. Investment into, when you talk about health disparities, special funding and scholarships and endowments to help, for example, increase the number of African American medical doctors and nurses and teachers. I think those are ways that could really help. You look in rural America, there's so much that can be done. I would support those type of appropriations to help support the community and just communities in general, particularly communities of color.
So, my brothers, we have another question from the audience from Brother Preston D. Mitchum, who asks, we know that voting may look different this year due to COVID-19. Internally, Brother President and I have conversations about how we can navigate that. He says, how do we, as Brothers of Alpha, increase vote by mail efforts, especially when data has shown that young people are not having access to actually cast their votes? And it shows young people are not having access to actually cast their votes. How do we increase vote by mail efforts, my brothers?
Well, I think first of all we have to use all.
I think there's something where.
Go ahead, Brother Harris, Dr. Harris.
Brother Ward?
Yes, I'll follow you, Brother Harris.
Well, I was going to say that we basically have to we've got to take this attitude of each one, teach one. A slogan we used to use in the we got to talk to some workshops. Now there'll need to be virtual workshops, but we need to walk people through the process. I've already requested my mail-in ballot because I want to get it, and I want to get it in way ahead of the deadline. This is one of those instances where I will not wait to the date that they say it needs to be mailed in. It needs to be postmarked. We need to get it in well in advance of the postmark date. Brother Ward?
Well, I certainly agree. And I think one of the things that we have to do is educate, promote, and continue to make this a number one priority. But what we are planning to do is use our own young scholars and leaders to advise and be the communicators in their own networks. Let me tell you, when young people decide they want to make something happen, it can happen. And they don't need any guidance from us. They've got the technology, they've got the networks, and they know how to make it happen. And so what we plan to do is support, give the kind of support and assistance that they may need, but we're going to turn it over to them and let them come up with the strategy and the plan on how to get the vote out. Now, we're going to encourage everyone to be very involved and to vote by mail because I think that this election is so important. It is so important for so many reasons that we've got to have everyone encouraged to cast that vote.
My brothers, we have room for one final question as we time flies, obviously, when you're having fun. And an hour goes by really, really quickly. We strongly encourage brothers to join us the first Monday of every month leading up to the election. Brother Dr. Harris will be joined by a General President, past and current. Obviously, we have Brother General President Ward here as we wrap up our conversation. So one more question, and then we'll wrap up our conversation as we wind down our hour. So are we ready for one last question, my brothers?
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Fantastic. We have a question from Brother Benjamin Jackson. He says, why do we have a lower voter turnout for local and state elections than we do presidential elections?
Well, if I might, and Brother Ward referenced this earlier about the importance of local elections, but so much attention is given to the presidential primary and the presidential election until people basically that's where they place their attention, not looking at the important role, for example, that your county attorney general will play in the lives of individuals. These are things that we've got to think about. And so we've got to break away from this every 4 years mode, so to speak. And that's why we've talked about individuals being involved in a process that goes on, that takes place. We need to be discussing these issues on a regular basis. And I think that hopefully will get people to think more broadly and not to think. Now, in some ways, you know, the powers that be, I think that's the best way for me to put it, only want us to look at the presidential election every 4 years without looking at our state senators, state representatives. Those individuals play important roles in our daily lives, maybe even more so than the president of the United States. But we've focused a lot of attention on the presidency. And I think that it's a pattern that hopefully will begin to break.
I agree that two things I'd like to add to the question in response, and that is I think as a community, every component of our community needs to be involved in the political process. All of our churches, our social organizations, everyone needs to be discussing politics and the issues that are happening at the local, the state, and the national level. I think that's critical. I think another key component of this conversation is having people to step forward and run for public office. And that's why I'm so encouraged by the young elected officials who have stepped forward, who are serving as mayors in cities. We've got fraternity brothers like Frank Scott and Randall Woodfin serving. We have Dr. Cameron Webb, who's running for Congress in Virginia. You've got Raphael Warnock running for the U.S. Senate. But those school board seats, those county commissioner seats, those, as Brother Harris said, your local district attorney seat, we need to run for every possible seat that's available, and then be the voice for the people once you get there. Don't just get elected and be celebratory because you now have a title. That's not why you run for public office. You run for public office to represent the people in your district and make sure that they have a voice at the table. So I encourage as many people to run for public office as possible, and be prepared, be courageous, be tenacious, and be willing to speak up and speak truth to power no matter where you find yourself.
Well said. Brother Paul?
My brothers. So here we go. There we go. We're back together. So I wanted to wrap up our last conversation, last minute, and give Brother Dr. Harris an opportunity to give some final words on this topic as we continue this discussion on the first Monday of every month. We thank everybody for tuning in. Don't forget to tell someone, tell a brother to watch this, and also follow us on social media at APA 1906 Network. So, Brother Dr. Harris, you have the final words as we wrap up our conversation, our outstanding conversation this evening. Thank you, brother.
Thank you very much, Brother Paul, and thank Brother Dr. Everett Ward for joining this conversation. Brother Ward and I can discuss these issues deep into the night with a little bourbon, of course. That will help smooth the conversation. But I appreciate the questions. As Alpha Men, of course, we knew that they were going to be incisive questions. These were questions that really went to the heart of the matter. And I hope that the brothers keep up this type of conversation, that they will tune in on the first Monday of each month as we explore these issues further. We're going to be looking at demographics the next time, and we have our good brother Mark Tillman, who is a master in looking at data. And that's one of the things that we're going to be doing, and we look forward to your involvement in this conversation.
Well, that wraps up a great conversation. I definitely want to take this point of personal privilege to ask our General President, do you have any final comments before we wrap up? Be sure you're not muted, Brother General President.
Thank you. I just want to thank Brother Harris for his leadership and for all that he does for our fraternity. We are honored to have this new forum. And Brother Harris, thank you so much. And we look forward to the future conversations.
Very good.
Fantastic. And with that being said, my brothers, thank you so much for joining us. We will see you on the next Monday of September. Thanks for joining the conversation, my brothers. 06, and stay healthy, stay safe.